Thank you. I will start right away with my topic because you can imagine in 3 years, actually 4.5 years of research, a lot of information shows up and a lot of material is gathered. So I would like to organize all this material into 3 sections. And I've been giving this talk in different sizes and circumstances before, so I might browse through some of the information to give you the opportunity to ask afterwards, so we don't have too much time on the details. So the first section is on the bow as an object, organological questions. You know quite a lot about French bows, but very little about German bows and even less about Italian bows. There's quite some information on English bows, so I'm not going to talk about that because, of course, I don't want to carry any owls to London. Okay, the second section is on performance practice. That's a perspective that's especially important to me. Thank you. Because, of course, bows are beautiful objects. On the other hand, I'm a musician, and for my own interest in bows, it's very important to use the bows and try to find out what they do by themselves. And this is a perspective that we have elaborated in a series of research projects. I call this an interface, because the bow is an interface between the musician and the instrument. That's a resonator, and I take that from electronic music as an idea, as a concept, because if you take the bow as an interface, the interface will tell you what options it has and what options it doesn't have. So if you look at the interface, you can make the bow speak about what it is intended for and what it was intended to be played, or what kind of bow strokes were intended to be produced with this kind of a bow. So this is the second aspect, and the third aspect would be social history, because people choose bows and have been choosing bows in history as we choose bows today. So these 3 sections will form my talk today, and actually each of those would be enough for another talk. So please do ask at the end if you would like to get more detail on some of the information. Starting with organology, and of course you all know the chronology of the Tourte bows. Now, modern history, science of history tells us that there is no such thing as a logical transition in history. Things emerge and disappear not in a logical way and not in direct ways. So even if there is a development in skill and model, there are many other opportunities and many other ways of looking at the evidence that we have. So it is a very beautiful timeline that we have with 5-year steps, but a historian would probably doubt this kind of a timeline. This is one of our starting points in our research project. The other one was this quotation from Spohr, because he warns young violinists who want to have a French-style bow not to buy a German bow, because the German bow might look French, but it doesn't work like a French bow. It wouldn't speak and sing in the French way, but rather in a German way. Although from the outside it is similar, it doesn't work as an interface in a French way. And this is one of the starting points to look at a bow not only from the outside, but also from the inside. And you all know that camber and balance are big issues here, and it's very hard to find out if camber has been altered or not. So let's start with evidence. This is where I have the most quality answers. I've been looking at sources of Saxon bow making at the time of Beethoven. Now this is one of the well-known catalogs of around 1825 to 1830, and you find very primitive bow models here. And even considering that the artist has not reproduced the models realistically, you can see that the cello bow has a very old-fashioned way, a battle axe head, and you see besides violin bow with floral ornaments, inlaid ornaments. You see another violin bow that in museums you would probably date to the 18th century, but this is the actual production at around 1825 to 1830 with a crémaillère frog. This is the description in the catalogue describing various qualities and materials. We found a lot of similar descriptions of qualities and prices in early sources that tell us that only a very small amount of the output resembles French models in that they would have valuable metal and mother-of-pearl attachments and ornaments. And the vast number of output would be simple bows without such metal ornaments. So we would ask in our research projects who bought which kind of a bow and what kind of music was played with all kinds of bow models and qualities. We are very lucky that in 1828 a young bow maker published a big book, a huge book on violin making and bow making as he learned it in Markneukirchen. And as a researcher, I have to be critical with these sources. We found out that Gustav Adolf Wettengel was born in 1801. So when he wrote this book, when he published it, he was 27 years old only. So all the information we get is quite recent and fresh. And his perspective, although very conservative, is not retrospect, but is really representative of the craft as practiced in 1828. He was a trained bow maker, but at that time he was working as a drawing teacher at the evening school. So that would be a design teacher at the bow making school of Markneukirchen at that time. He later moved on to be a salesman in Leipzig and did not make any bows anymore. But his information is very valuable as he was, as a teacher, distributing the knowledge of his time. This is a detail, and although this bow should be the representation of the normal French style output, you see that at the end there is something that is definitely not French. Wettengel calls this a cornice seating. This is the nut and groove seating that you find in many German bows, but not only in German bows and other bows as well. And this is still the standard, although the bow looks French, it has a German characteristic with the cornice seating. You find it on many bows like this. The frog slides on this very clever construction, so it was used for centuries actually. You find it on many bows, even on late bows like this. This is probably a bow from the time of the publication of Wettengel's book. But many people consider this cornice seating, and I'd like to use the original terminology for that because the other terminology is only descriptive. The cornice construction has been used into the 20th century for cheaper bows, even with open frog bows, but also with modern closed frogs. So this is probably why we tend to consider this construction feature as typically German, but it extends to other repertoire as well. So in his book, he includes templates, and you recognize something that is intended to represent French models, the standard violin head and the frog, and buttons with facets or just round buttons. But at the same time, he does also give templates and describes the manufacturing of turned buttons that you would probably date to the late 18th century, and to the ornate frog of ivory or bone that you would see on Kramer bows. And this is described in present tense in his bow. So it's still part of the active knowledge of young violin bow makers in Markneukirchen at 1828. And now comes the fascinating bit of information, because he does also give the head of a Kramer style bow, and he calls it a Viennese head. And this has been very striking because for Vienna, nobody knew up to this find what kind of a bow was being used in Vienna. There's no information, although Rudolf Hopfner from the Kunsthistorisches Museum has researched a lot for decades actually to find out. Now we have information from Wettengel that obviously in Markneukirchen young bow makers considered this kind of a Kramer type of head, a Viennese style head. So we can deduce all kinds of things. Let me just browse through this. The most important thing is, of course, it is connected with conservative Vienna at as late as 1828, and obviously the style has been reproduced when in Paris the modern Tourte model was probably accepted by most professional musicians. So you find the cornice here in this cello bow, and the most important information is that we need to rethink dating these bows. The time span that we could put our dates for bows like this extends a lot. So we need additional strategies to find out, is this an early example or is it a late example? And for that we would try to find out if it was used in a conservative context or in a progressive context. Look at the materials. Valuable materials tend to be earlier, to be dated earlier, and the less valuable probably later. But all of this is very difficult and needs to be looked at in every single case. I found, by the way, a bow that I'm quite sure that Wettengel built himself because it exactly matches his templates. Although this is a bow in the Italian style. Browse through this, why this is Italian, and I found another bow that might be of Wettengel's production. Okay, so this is about bow making in Markneukirchen. There was another center of violin and bow making, as you know, violin making town of Markneukirchen. You might not know that they had a very considerable output of violin bows as well. And archive information tells us that violin bow making ceased around 1840 because violin bow makers complain they don't have as good access to exotic woods and timbers as the Saxon bow makers. Anyway, in the time that we're looking at, both towns were actively making bows at considerable numbers, and it's hard to find bows from Mittenwald because, of course, they are not signed or dated. So we went at local to see local collections, and in Innsbruck, near Mittenwald, there's a museum that gathered many things that are not on display, but in the magazine. So we found that there is one bow model that obviously is not very expensive, and has been collected together with other not very expensive local instruments. So we deduce from that that this kind of a bow model should be a local bow model from which time. It has the cornice, it has a distinct head with a tip, and the back of the head swings back a little bit like the Kramer model, so it's a German model. We think that this is the standard cheap bow model of Mittenwald around 1800, and then later Mittenwald is trying to catch up with international markets, trying to produce a French model as well. This is definitely not Markneukirchen model, and with the nose pointed up, it's quite possible that this has been produced in Mittenwald, especially with the sharp edges of the nose over here, and the square back of the head. This would be an indication that this is a Mittenwald production. There is a late Mittenwald production that has been sold in Munich with stamps of Munich violin dealers, and you see in this Munich bow another cornice, but if you look at these cornice seatings differ in Mittenwald from Markneukirchen styles, because in Markneukirchen the cornice goes out of the stick without a ridge or without an end. But in Mittenwald it ends, it doesn't go out with a tool. So this would be one of the details how to differentiate a Mittenwald, a northern German cornice construction from a southern German cornice construction. And of course, the next step to the famous Viome seating is not very far, and I think political reasons have made Viome look at other alternatives to construct bows after 1830 with Louis Philippe and the change in politics, but maybe we can talk about that later. Okay, so finally, what kinds of bows have been used in Vienna? This is very difficult, and we likewise looked at local collections, private collections, people who would not buy their items at international auctions, but collect them from local dealers and antique shops. So we found one model that has a striking concentration in the collections, in the private collections of Viennese collectors, which is a Kramer model with a very bold forehead, I would say. And considering that in Vienna musicians were very conservative, it is again very hard to date this model. Anyway, we can find a development in this model, which is obviously later than the one I just showed you, the Kramer type with the typical Kramer frog. Now we have a more modern frog with 8-faceted end of the stick and a head that resembles more French concepts with an independent head, although obviously with the head swinging back, it's still not French. But in this bow that we will get to see and hear later on, all the measurements are exactly of a modern standard tourte bow, the height of the head, the height of the frog, and the length of the stick. But all the characteristics, the stylistic characteristics, point to the opposite direction, to Vienna. So I think this is a late example of a typically Viennese bow that could have been made and used as late as the 1830s. Okay, all of these bows show a cornice construction, which is again different from the two construction types I showed before. So looking at all those late styles, conservative styles that were intended not to look French, I have come to the conclusion that we need a word for this. And if we call that Kramer bow, that's not the right style anymore. So I discussed this with many colleagues, and we came to the conclusion to call it the Biedermeier bow, the Biedermeier style, because Biedermeier is the style in art and crafts at that time that would be the surrounding of those bows. And I would like to show you why I call this a Biedermeier bow, with rounded off edges and smooth appearance. If you look at a tourte bow with sharp edges and contrasting metal and ebony and mother of pearl, to an art historian, this is not just a bow, this is an example of French classicism. Why is that French classicism? And if that's French classicism, why would the other type of bow be a German Biedermeier? You just look at some of the furniture. You have the contrast, you have the metal applications, you have rather dark brown or chocolate brown colors. On the other hand, in Germany, you have rounded off edges, you have bright colors and bright wood varnishes. So you can see all of this in the bow as an object. We tend to look at it as a modern bow, but it really is an object of the French classicism. And likewise, the German bow with the inward curve of the head that's smooth and not sharp, and with a curved frog without metal applications, that's obviously very close to the style and the feel of a Biedermeier object. Same with a chair. Look at the sharp edges, the contrast, the black color, although this is paint, and the metal applications. No applications in Germany, smooth and rounded off edges, not the edges behind, but in front of the chair, all the edges are rounded off, and so on and so on. You find, again, all these characteristics in these bows. So I'm looking at the modern bow in a new way. Same here, metal applications, contrasts, German and French classicism. I think this is quite striking. And why is this important for me as a musician or as a researcher? I try to find out what the atmosphere is that these tools have been used in. So this is a salon. Unfortunately, it's very hard to see with this beamer. But we can imagine ourselves entering a French salon with a tourte bow and entering a German salon with a Biedermeier bow, and we'll probably have different expectations because entering rooms like this will help us getting a very intuitive approach to what the bow can tell us and what the music should sound like, together with the information that we have that we need to bring to life. So this is the end of the organological section. Let's move on to the performance practice issues. Fortunately, there is a reviewer of the concert season in Warsaw of 1811 who got the chance of listening to French and German or Italian musicians as they traveled through Warsaw on their way to St. Petersburg. And this reviewer sums up the characteristics of French violin playing and contrasts that to the non-French way of playing, which he combines as a German and Italian way of producing sounds and articulations. And he divides this in three different characteristics. I translated this. So on the right-hand side, that's the original quotation, and my translation on the other side. So the Viotti school is characterized by a big, strong, and full tone. Obviously, that's due to the tourte bow. Secondly, by the fusion into powerful, intense, beautifully conjoined singing. And by beautifully conjoined singing, I assume that this is the extended use of portamento that we see in the sources. And thirdly, the diversity, stimulus, shadow and light through most different bowings. That's the passages that become so famous in the Viotti school to have different bowing patterns in the passages. On the other hand, the conservative school is characterized by a pleasant tone, not a full and powerful one that suits the Biedermeier and earlier style of bow. Great lightness and dexterity, gracefulness, and so on. So I put them into an order, volume, passages, and expressive lines, and Tartini calls passage work suonabile, instrumental way of playing, and expressive lines, an expressive cantabile way of playing. If you combine all of this, you would have a good description of what the French school is characterized in these three basic categories: volume, passages, and expressivity. It is interesting that he talks about wizardry being part of the Italian and German way of virtuosity. We will find that again with Paganini, of course, who is obviously a member of the Italian school. If we look at details of the playing styles, and I would really browse through this, we can see that different playing characteristics are combined with the different bows. The Kramer style combines springing bow strokes and passages, something that in the classical times before Kramer nobody would have dared to use, because it was a cuss word in Germany for playing passages in separate bow strokes. It was called Fitscheln and was a characteristic for amateur playing. So only the amateurs would play passages with separate bow strokes as we do it today. So if somebody would come back from the 18th century, they would probably call us amateurs in the way we deal with passage work in the classical style. Okay, another very striking characteristic for Rode is the contre-coup d'archet and the use of vibrato and all kinds of other things. Browse through this. Now, Woldemar, a violin teacher and violinist in Paris at that time, talks about the transition of the Kramer bow to the Viotti bow, which is obviously the new modern tourte bow. And he claims that by 1802, most professionals would have changed from the Kramer bow to the modern tourte bow. And this has been accepted for all environments, musical environments in Europe, but we can now say that it's probably only true for Paris and maybe for France. I'm not even sure if it's true for Marseille and Bordeaux at the same time, at least not before the Conservatoire tried to have uniform testing at all the conservatories throughout the country. So I think it is definitely a true information, but it probably applies only to Paris, at least around 1800. So we do find bows from around 1800 representing both styles, but we can find late examples as well. So I think this is due to political reasons, and this is a map of the influence of Napoleon and French politics in Europe. The dark blue is the mainland and the countries that are ruled by his family, and the light blue ones are the allies and forced allies. And you see most of Germany is part of the Confederation of the Rhine, a 6-year confederation that was forced to be formed by the defeated German states. Okay, so looking at sources, of course, Louis Spohr is a very important source for that time, and the fact that it was published in Vienna should not tell us that everyone in Vienna would use a bow like the one that is depicted in Spohr's violin school, because of course he depicts a very clear Tourte model, even from different angles, to show that it has all the features of a modern bow. Spohr was known as a follower of Rode, and he even claims in his autobiography that for the longest time people have accused him of being a copy of Rode, although he thought he was independent already. And many things that we see in the Spohr tradition in Germany are actually things that come from the older Viotti school, while in France with Bayeux, violin playing has changed already. So what we think about as a German school of violin playing is very much closer to the early Rode and Viotti school than to something that is genuinely German. Here's another interesting information on the bows by a colleague of Louis Spohr. He was an advocate of the Tourte bow himself. He was also for some years teacher at the French Conservatoire, and he gives an information that's quite unique, because he tells us that springing bow strokes in this revolutionary style of playing were not fashionable, because of course they were characteristics of the old Kramer style of playing passages. So it was Ancien Régime style to play passages in the way Kramer did. He says that musicians should avoid springing bow strokes because otherwise the music would not sound serious enough. So seriousness was one of the characteristics of the French way of playing when the Tourte bows were new. So I conclude that the Tourte bow was not intended to produce springing bow strokes the way that modern players now try to produce. And we have quite some evidence that most of the Tourte bows have been rebent in the middle of the 19th century, when violin playing in France changed back to incorporating springing bow strokes again. Again after 1830, when political circumstances changed. Why am I saying this? Because in his book, Bernhard Romberg gives a chart of his bows, not only his bows, also his setup, the French setup of his cello. But he talks about his bow, and we know that he owned 2 Tourte bows. One of them is, I think, still record-breaking cello bow auction price, the Tourte number 1 of his possession. He says about the bow in playing situation that the bow should be, Q ist der Cellobogen, wie er in seiner Länge und Spannung nach sein muss. Es passt die kleine Spannung zu einem fließenden Spiele nicht, Um ihn aber nicht alle Elastizität zu benehmen, muss er so gespannt werden, dass die Oberlinie des Bogens vom Frosch angerechnet mit der Unterlinie des Kopfes zusammentrifft. So he says the stick should be almost straight, and the inward curve in playing condition is only as much as the diameter of the stick at the head, so it's very little. So this would be probably the way he used his two toured cello bows when he was famous and touring Europe as one of the most famous cello virtuosos. We had a series of tests with professors of our music school, and we exposed them to 12 bows that we thought are in almost untouched conditions, and they were asked to find out if they would readily play French or German playing styles. So we set up a questionnaire and a test paper with characteristic playing bow strokes and playing styles, and this questionnaire, and almost 90% of them, or in 90% of the cases, they agreed that the bow would be more French or more suited to play non-French playing styles and playing characteristics. So this would be a small statistical survey on the fact that bows are actually interfaces. Let's move to politics. As I said, and even today, Vienna's musical culture is one of the most conservative one, and in Beethoven's time, which is not a bad thing, it's just the way it is, there was an instrument, many instruments that were typically Viennese, like the five-string double bass called Viennese double bass, or the Viennese piano action, something that has been produced until World War I. And also the typical Viennese violin with a typical varnish. You have many things that are typically Viennese. So why not imagine a bow going with these other conservative Viennese styles? Especially if you looked at not only the varnish, but also the neck construction is quite conservative. So, but that's another topic. I don't call it Baroque, but traditional. You see that in Italian instruments as well of the 19th century, that they have so-called Baroque neck constructions, even in Naples. So there's one very interesting instance, because when Rode traveled back from St. Petersburg, his tenure in St. Petersburg, and he traveled through Vienna, he was supposed to give a concert together with Beethoven and Archduke Rudolph. And so Beethoven composed a sonata for Rode to suit Rode's style, although this was not a style that he was used to hearing among his musicians. So, well, here's a description of some of the Rode playing techniques. That is the détaché appuyé, a very strict and stiff détaché that Baillot warns his students in 1834 only to use for the older style of Viotti repertoire, but not for the newer one. So it's really a characteristic of the time of this playing style around 1800. And you see that in the Rode stroke with Spohr school and Campagnoli's reference to Abstoßen as well. So it's a distinct playing characteristic. And I think we can see that in the composition of his sonata opus 96. And Claire has promised to play some of these just for you to have a quick idea what it would sound like. Before you get prepared, I should give you the next slide, because Beethoven even writes in a letter that he had a very hard time adjusting to the playing style of Rode, because he was used to have rauschende Passagen, obviously brightly sprung both passages in his finales. But in this case, he could not compose them, because Rode was not able to perform them in the way Beethoven would expected him to do that. So, Claire, would you try for us to play the yellow line with a staccato at the tip, something that the toured bow can produce in a very special way, and that has been explored by the Viotti school? Maybe with the French bow, yes? Okay, and there's this crescendo. I think there's a very... Right. So you probably have good control at the tip of the bow for this kind of a staccato. Let's try to play this with the Viennese bow that I showed you earlier.
Immediately it wants to come off.
Yes.
You see, you lose the contact there.
Right.
It's possible, but
You have to force it. Yes. It wouldn't do it by itself. So it's not made for that, obviously, because this is one of the very obvious characteristics of the tourte bow. Let's look at the next, the détaché appuyé, a very strict on the string détaché.
Bio in the middle.
Yes, it's in the middle. I think to understand the détaché, the appuyé, it's really strict and very square, I think.
Okay, all right.
Yes. Les bow, yes, like this. A very controlled, very square, very massive bow stroke. Try to produce that with the Viennese bow.
Kicks off.
Okay, I think it's very obvious. Let's look at the contre-coup d'archet to understand why this is French, because it combines playing at the tip with a very distinct rhythm, a marching rhythm that everyone identified with the Marseillaise rhythm. Okay, now imagine this is Marseillaise marching, and with the characteristics of these very on the string playing, very controlled, uplifting. Right, I think this would be the style of the Rode interpretation, uplifting, very controlled, very extrovert. Try to do that with the Viennese bow.
It's not going to work.
It's just too elegant. Yes. Right. All of this coloring is in the bow and was expected by Viennese musicians. So they really had a hard time adjusting to something that they wouldn't understand if they were not French and if they had not seen people going on the streets and overthrowing their world around them. So this is probably really, thank you very much. So this is to understand really why these bow types are worlds apart. And this is why people not only had a hard time changing bows, they would have to change everything that they believe in, that they were thinking about, and that they were doing really. So we looked at Franz Clement, who was the first violinist who performed Beethoven's Violin Concerto, and he obviously, as in all descriptions and reviews, was characterized as a representative of the old Italian or German way of playing, Zierlichkeit, Nettigkeit, Eleganz, Zartheit, Reinheit, all of these characteristics that go with the bow that we have just seen, Leichtigkeit, an ease in the type of bowing, even when he plays very difficult passages, all of this. We have a hint at this playing style again by Jo, because he tells his students not to play Beethoven's Violin Concerto in the French style. So he explains to them how to perform this piece in a Viennese style, and he even reproduces Clement's bowings, as we know that from Joseph Joachim, who studied in Vienna with a colleague of Clement, with Böhm, and who also referred to these bowings as Clement's bowings. Clement was also described as using not only a conservative Kramer-style bow, but in Geschichte des Konzertwesens, Hans Lick tells us that he used a short bow nach Old Italian fashion, in Old Italian fashion. So I assume that the Beethoven Violin Concerto was not only performed with a bow like this, which I think has been used as late as the 1830s in Vienna, in conservative Vienna. It was probably performed on a bow that we would call a Baroque bow, a classical bow. This is what Hans Lick tells us about Franz Clement, and there are some other reports that confirm that Franz Clement, who was a child prodigy, refused to change his styles as he grew older. Okay, we have a little bit of evidence for that. This is a lithograph from Vienna showing a break in an orchestra rehearsal. And if you look at this closer, you would find some information on the bows used, although as a scientist, researcher, we need to be critical to find out, is this a realistic representation or not? And if you look at the scenery, the scene, you see that the concertmaster gets some tobacco from the horn player in the front. Here, that's the horn player, and he gives the concertmaster some tobacco while the violinists rehearse their parts. What do the wind players do? The other horn player eats, and the bassoon player blows up his cheeks. Amateur violin players, you can see they arrived in couches, they have clean shoes, elegant shoes, they have elegant clothing, while all the wind players have street clothing. So these are the professional paid musicians who in Viennese orchestras perform the wind parts. And most of the string parts, maybe with some exceptions, concertmaster and so on, were amateur players. They were not bad players, but they were players who would not take any Anweisung, what's that? Anweisung? They wouldn't take any commands from a concertmaster. Although he is a professional, he was much lower in rank. So the problem with Viennese orchestras is that the string did what they wanted. They would just not behave like in the conservatoire when everyone was well trained and Abenek had a good conducting. So look at all these amateurs. What kind of a bow are they playing? Of course, these tips, they are not Kramer tips, but even earlier styles. And if you look at the way they hold their bows, you see that they hold their bows with a thumb under the frog, which is really old-fashioned French way of playing. This is probably very likely not a realistic representation of a rehearsal of an orchestra, but a caricature, an exaggeration. But what the artist wants to tell us is that Viennese orchestras, at least the string players, were not only conservative, they were extremely conservative. Okay, so this is what we take as an information surrounding the decision. Here's one violin by Andreas Karl Leb that came with a bow that I thought would be of a later date, but now I'm not so sure anymore. It could be contemporary if used by an amateur who didn't need to make money with his music. Okay, looking at other amateur players at that time, because we found a bow that was owned by him. That's Count Mathieu Vygorsky, a very fine amateur cellist. He took cello lessons while he was staying in Vienna for several years during the Viennese Congress time. And this is very likely the bow that he used at that time. Unfortunately, in his portrait from 1828, he uses a modern Tourte bow on his later Duport cello. And at that time, he had lessons with Romberg, so obviously he changed to the French style of playing. But before, he used this kind of a bow. And although you find characteristics that resemble from the outside French bows, like applications of metal, even here at the end of the frog, this is an open frog. It is not a ferrule, but it's only an ornament that covers the end of the frog. So metal applications are being quoted, but not used as functional devices in this way. So you find the similarities of those two bows, very expensive, elaborate one, and a very simple one. Obviously, a style that has been used as late as the 1815, 1820. And to conclude this section, we even have a letter by Joseph Böhm, who premiered Beethoven's Opus 127 string quartet, that he was given 2 Tourte bows that were sent to him from Paris and were chosen in the workshop of Tourte by Rudolf Kreutzer. And he refuses these bows, telling, die Bogen taugen nichts. They're no use. They don't work. And he not only sends his own bow back, but he persuades Haslinger, the publisher of Spohr's violin school, to send back his Tourte bow as well. And this is from 1824. This tells you something. I think this is really the last piece of evidence that we can be quite sure that at least some of the Viennese musicians would not get along with a modern Tourte bow. And this even has implications for Paganini. I browsed through this. You all know these two famous portraits, and people have suspected that the artist's freedom has given Paganini a Kramer-style bow in his hand. And this is a more modern bow. We found out that this is a reproduction of this earlier portrait. And this portrait is a frontispiece in a book by Karl Gur, who was the concert manager of Paganini's German tours, who published a book on Paganini's secrets and was the first one who observed how he really had his scordatura tuning and how he used the bow and so on and so on. So we were trying to find out, is this freedom, artistic freedom, or did Paganini actually use a Kramer-style and transitional style bow when he was touring Germany, especially when you consider this portrait, famous portrait by Ingres of 1819, when he was in Rome. And if you look at the portrait, this is again being critical with sources, iconographic sources, you've heard about that earlier. The way Paganini holds the bow is clearly intended to show the viewer, look, I'm using a French bow. At that time, he was employed in Lucca by the sister of Napoleon, so he better use a French bow. When the French moved out, or maybe just because he toured Germany, he used another bow. And by looking at details of his bow hold, we can find that this is really a portrait from life. It's hard to see, but it is depicted that his ring finger overlaps the middle finger, only in this portrait, not in the other one. And this is a characteristic that's described by many reviewers. And you find that in an English portrait as well, that the ring finger sticks out over the other finger. So we're quite sure that even Paganini did not use a French bow all through his career, that he used different bows. Maybe he even adapted to the country that he was touring, because I think in this portrait he uses an English bow. So the choice of bow can have different backgrounds and different decisions. And in this case, I think it was to be friendly to the audiences. Thank you for your attention.